Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. My name is James Bennett. I'm from Televisual. Welcome to our session, exploring the importance of a managed HDR color pipeline. The idea here is to give you practical advice and some guidance. I'm joined with an amazing panel, people I've worked closely with over the last couple of years. Let's start with Asa Scholl, colorist from Warner Brothers Delane Lee. Asa is an incredibly accomplished colorist, has an incredible credit list, perhaps best known for Netflix The Crown, where he's done all seasons. He's also done FX's Devs recently, for which he won an award, or two, I think. And also recently TX Netflix Behind Her Eyes, which isn't HDR, the others are. And Mission Impossible as well. And crikey, the list is very long and very illustrious. Tom Mitchell, technical director from Mission, joins us as well. Mission are responsible for some of the most high-profile HDR productions shooting in the UK and around the world. Recent credits include Netflix's Rebecca, which I thought was superb, I hasten to add, and shouldn't be compared to Hitchcock. Netflix Enola Holmes, and also Netflix Emma, among others. We're also joined by Paco Ramos, who is Mission's new head of color. He also has a great track record with color supervision, including Amazon's Unfortunate Stories, Amazon's, I hope I got this right, Ache, and
Netflix, it's a Netflix show.
Yeah, and movie stars Reyes de la Noche.
Yeah.
We want to carry this session at a reasonable pace and cover up as many touch points as we can. And if all goes to plan, to try and contain it within the hour, if not 45 minutes. It's not for lack of items to discuss. There's lots here and there's lots that comes from it. It's out of respect for your time. To note, and it's an important note at this point, this session is being staged by Televisual and Mission and sponsored by Sony and Leader Electronics. That is, this is an editorial piece based on expert knowledge from our panelists, none of whom are being paid to be part of this panel. It's a really important key point. Their observations and their guidance here are their opinions. These are not sponsored opinions, they're their opinions. It is also no coincidence that Sony and Leader Instruments want to sponsor this event. Both are gold standard vendors for HDR monitoring and test and measurement, and both have enviable market shares within that space. And also a big shout out to Big Pit Media and BAM Pro for supporting the event. The demand for HDR, and more often 4K HDR, is accelerating, and it's accelerating rapidly in both the UK and US. It's driven by the streamers, it's driven by home cinema, Netflix, Amazon, Apple, and many others. Full frame, large format, HDR can be just as unforgiving. Clipped highlights look more clipped, and noise in the shadows looks much, much, much worse. Many have likened HDR to a new paint palette, a new color palette, but perhaps it is better thought of as a more sensitive canvas on which to project light and color. And when done well, brings a more vivid and immersive experience. HDR requires different choices, different production protocols, and changed workflows. And these choices, protocols, and workflows are still maturing and gaining traction across the community. The ambition for this session is to speed up the adoption of current best practice by identifying where things go wrong, how to avoid them, and how technology can help. Our agenda: to rise above the compartmentalized, it's a big word, compartmentalized view of production workflow, and try to look at HDR color management as one continuous joined up process from prep through delivery. And so better realize the director's creative intent, which is what all of my panelists are here to do. And with the judicious use of technology in the right hands, this approach should save money that can better be spent on creativity for a better final result. So it's about spending, as my old chairman used to say, your job is not to save money, it is to spend it wisely. Right, we're going to crack on. We're going to start, I hope, in a fairly understandable, comprehensible approach, which is we're going to start with what are the issues? What happens when it goes wrong? And I'm going to start with Tom and just say, Tom, what's wrong with monitoring in 709? Why is that an issue?
Well, I think as time comes, as time goes by, we're basically now seeing more and more content in as a HDR deliverable, and we're obviously seeing significant amounts of content in multiple deliverables, whether it's on your iPhone, which most of the iPhones now are all, and the iPads are all HDR as well. The issue is with it's basically with the sort of the contrast of the scene that you're not basically getting a sense of. I would always say seeing is believing, particularly with the highlights. So I often sometimes show people an example where you've got a candle against a wall, and when you're looking in a 709 monitor, the candle looks just as bright as the reflection or the hotspot on the wall. And yet, when you look at it in an HDR monitor, the candle is so much considerably, so much brighter than the wall. And sometimes that can actually be distracting. Now, if you're a cinematographer, you might actually, if you saw that, instantly you'd walk in, you would instantly know that it's a problem. And you would go, right, what can I do about that to fix it? And you just don't get that sense without having some sort of HDR monitoring on set or measurement equipment that can also show you that.
I'm going to hand over to Asa and bring us all in here. But Asa, we've talked about the crown many, many times. One surprise I've always found is that you cap the nits at 400 nits. How does this translate to the shoot? How do you define and retain that nit level in the shoot? What do you do? What do you say?
Well, we didn't exactly go 400, but we found that 400, almost nothing went over that. And in fact, the majority was about 180 nits. So it's not like an incredibly, using the high dynamic range in its extreme. What we did was basically after season 1 and 2, which were just SDR deliverables, and there's the mistake, we remastered them. We were asked to remaster them around the time we were doing season 3 for HDR. And in those, because they'd already set the look and no one was used to HDR, the creatives, we pretty much kept it almost in that SDR mode and just let some of the highlights come through at a very low level. But what we did notice there was that the clipping that had occurred in some windows, which was a creative decision on season 1 or 2, became distracting. A clip level, probably as the viewers can see, the light behind James, we're losing detail and it's brighter than his face and his shirt's clipping slightly. And those things become ugly in a way, or Americans would say egregious or distracting, or look like video rather than film. So when Adriano Goldman, the main cinematographer, and I started on doing prep for season 3, we looked at those, and he actually, in viewing his test HDR, could see that he could put more silks on the windows. He could light foregrounds more and take everything down. He even did on season 4 underexposure passes at the end of a take for windows and shot curtains and things, so that if they were clipped, we had things that we could come back in and fix them. So those were the things that helped us on season 3 and 4. And on season 3, because we graded HDR first, the creatives got more used to that range, and it went up to sort of 300-400 in places without people sort of leaping for their sunglasses or finding it distracting.
But going back to those windows though as well, I'm thinking about HDR monitoring on set.
Yeah.
And what are you seeing in the grade if that window is shot and they're looking at a Rec 709 monitor? Yeah. What can happen when you get into the grade in HDR?
Well, when you get into the grade, you do realise that it's much brighter than SDR. It could be great, could be used for effect. Often, if there is detail there, it's fantastic. Skies look absolutely incredible. But if it's much brighter, then the face or the person in the foreground will appear to be darker. Or if you want to make things less bright, you bring it down, you have to play with it. You're going to key it, you're going to flatten it off, you're going to, different approaches. So it's more of being fixed rather than being massaged or being right in the first instance and just working on other aspects within that frame. So HDR monitoring on set is brilliant, and would be brilliant if more people did it, because they can adjust, like Tom was saying with the candle story, to get the image they're capturing closer to what we're finally going to grade. And it is mainly that clipping of highlights in practicals or in windows, or things just being distracting that you really can see on set if you're monitoring HDR.
Can I ask a question to Show about that? When you deal with those moments, with those moments where actually there's a huge contrast that you couldn't see in SDR, do you sometimes have to make the decision of bringing everything within SDR levels? So in a HDR format, in an HDR deliverable, bring it all in SDR levels, so it actually is less distracting, and actually the contrast ratio is similar to the SDR ones.
I don't think I've ever had to bring it all the way in, as it were, if there's windows or details that are bright. If they're tiny little bright things that then look like laser points through, like car headlights in the distance, we would use a texture highlight to diffuse those slightly, which will soften them and not make them look so piercing. But large areas of brightness, you might bring everything down and then key or lift faces back up, or just a combination of keys and curves to get them closer together. Whereas you might accept that sky being that bright if the foreground or the character or whatever it was closer to it, and might maybe be over 100 nits as well.
Thanks.
Back to that, I can come back to that idea of car headlights, actually, which you mentioned there. One of the things that I've heard from people who shot using HDR monitoring is that suddenly you're much more aware of those background light sources. Yeah. And more to the point, you might be able to paint out that background light source, but then you can't paint out the ambient light that's thrown from, for example, car headlights. And this is again the importance of that HDR monitoring on set. And Asa, and again, this is something I know you feel quite strongly about in terms of that massaging the shot, or understanding the shot in the context of the grade in HDR as an important point.
Yeah, I think that's it. Is I think your brain, your eye can realize very quickly, looking at an image, if something's wrong with it, if something's had to be done, if it looks graded or manipulated, the curve doesn't look right, the light falling on things or backlight has been pulled down. And you see it all the time. It's probably equivalent to someone doing a sound mix where something was distorted and they've had to, do ADR. I always seem to be able to hear ADR, or sometimes sound effects and Foley are really over obvious. And it's to those things as well visually. I mean, you can have things graded quite bizarrely as a look, and it still works within the narrative and the story. But it's when you've had to fix certain images. The classic one is backlight, car headlights with someone in the foreground who just disappears or flares out. And you're right, if you fix one thing in the background, your brain is like, what's all this happening? It doesn't make any sense. So yes, it's the education of HDR with DPs mainly, and to help them try and realize on set what that new range will do. Sometimes it's fantastic, and they use that for effect. They want a dark figure against a bright sky. That can be really powerful.
And if I can, I'm just taking the antithesis of this. Tom, isn't the problem every bit as great in underexposing as well?
Yeah, exactly. So with HDR, a lot of people, we talk about the highlights a lot, but we don't actually really talk about so much the mid and the shadows so much. When you're sometimes shooting low contrast scenes, like you could take, for example, like the candlelit stuff, where you're in a nice warm fire, you're normally pushing the camera to its limits. The cameras are typically daylight balanced. Sometimes you're pushing the camera by a stop or so, and you're losing about 2/3 of a stop because it's tungsten lighting. And that's something on a 7nm monitor can look a little bit noisy, and you just think, well, if I just tweak the blacks and crush them a bit, it'll be fine. But then as soon as you just play it on a HDR monitor and you start applying the grade, and you're adjusting the contrast, you're basically all of a sudden you just see this huge amount of noise floor that you wouldn't have normally seen on an SDR monitor. And again, just by staring straight in front of the on a HDR monitor, having one right there in front of you, you immediately see the problem, and if you can see it, you can fix it right then and there. And also with monitoring equipment, it often shows up on the monitoring equipment, like on the set of scopes. You can see the little line at the bottom, and you can see that line get fatter and fatter as you start to really push the image as well. So without those tools, you don't know about it until you get into grade, and you've got like Asa sort of trying to massage the image, or trying to inform the DP softly about the bad news about the image. So we always want to know. No one wants to be in that situation. We want to avoid it up front. So I can't say enough why it's important to monitor from the get-go.
I cannot begin to express just how much noisier noise is in HDR compared to in SDR. In SDR, and Asa will be better informed than I am here, but in SDR, you can crush that black potentially and get away with it. But in HDR, you're just left with that noise, which if you turn that into a crushed black, suddenly turns into quite a weird scene. Would that be right, Asa?
Yeah, you also get problems when you try and treat it in certain ways, that if you denoise it, then you often on broadcast, you get a kind of solarizing or posterizing effect. And sometimes we add a tiny, minute bit of grain to dither that. But it is about, it always comes back to monitoring, building LUTs beforehand, testing these cameras. Last week did 2 different camera formats against each other, because the DP wasn't used to the one that which was a Sony Venice that he was going to be using, at all different exposure levels, and ND and over and under various stops, and it's always informative. But it was like, oh crikey, when we go to that level at that ISO setting, we get a huge amount of noise in the shadow. So then put it on this one, and you'll clean it up, or put some more light in. Yeah.
And again, isn't it all? And where do you start on any production? And how do you start, and how do you plan? And thinking about it from working backwards from the deliverables. What does that mean to you, Asa? Before we go into
well, that's what we always do. I mean, we call post-production, but we're pre now, and we have to be script stage, testing stage. But we always start with the deliverables, which can be quite complicated. Different streaming services and broadcasters have different requirements, both for what they're going to broadcast and what they want to archive. So you start with those, usually a larger working format possibly than you're going to deliver. Cinema might still be 2K. You're going to be UHD for most streaming services, but then they might want the camera native for an extra 5%. So you want to be very careful about what you're going to be shooting on, how you're going to be capturing the image if it's large enough, color space as well, and color pipelines, which we've been through before, like with ACES and things. But then it's like, once those are approved at the deliverable stage, and we're happy with that, we're then with the DP camera testing so that they know what to capture, what kind of format. Then we would check with the main visual effects vendor. Hopefully one is on board by that time, because they might say, oh, we only want to work at 2K, or we're going to work at 239. They were like, well, we have to deliver open gate or something, so you have to do that. Or they talk to production about possibly working at 3K or higher on those visual effects. Again, it's a tough one, because all the deliverables might not be anything higher than SDR HD to begin with. But you'll be pretty sure that within a year, 2 or 3, or however long, or during production, someone will say, we're going to need HDR. Having done that with a VFX vendor, we also include dailies to make sure that they're happy with those pipelines. So there's lots of back and forth, making sure that everyone's on the same page before you start filming.
So think about the creation of the LUT and the LMTs.
Yeah.
Thinking about the creation of that LUT, with working with the cinematographer, and what are you doing in the prep room? Are you looking at HDR monitors? Are you looking at them in every single permutation, and are you testing those images? And
yeah, that's what we'll be doing. Well, depending on yes, I mean it's basically yes. If it's a TV show, you're straight to HDR. I can monitor HDR and SDR at the same time in my suite, and you're looking at them on both. If it's a feature film, it's probably projected P3, but then it's after that going through lens choices or camera makeup, whatever you're there doing, you would say, okay, let's have a look at it in HDR. And this is another thing we do for visual effects. Are visual effects aware they're working, they need to work HDR, they need to check their images, because if you're working on visual effects, you're not going to be able to afford 300 HDR monitors, I would imagine. So we often host VFX checks during filming, months before we're actually going to be grading anything, projected P3, and then check them in HDR to see if everything's broken, if you can see a huge light through the window that's actually on a crane, all these things that will come up to try and steer them away from having to be fixed later on, or any problems.
Well, absolutely, and I think you touched upon something there, which is that HDR monitoring is believable in various points of the curve. We're going to come on to that, I think, but at the same time as that, within VFX, it's a bit of an expensive line item. As
yes.
300, 10K, let alone 30K monitors, it starts to become unbelievable. So again, thinking about how you achieve those images in HDR, and what you're looking for in that prep room. I'm going to come back to you, Asa, first of all, and Tom, I'm going to pass on to you here. What are you looking? What are you testing for? What are you testing for those images?
firstly, we want to, well, depends sort of what the test is. So we'll probably have camera tests and lens tests, hair and makeup, and then hopefully location. And at each stage, they're slightly different. But you want the cinematographer and director, whoever's with you, to be aware of what they're capturing and what they might need to capture or be aware of for the kind of look they're going for that story. It's all got to be story-led. It's got to work the narrative. You've got to enhance where you're directing the eye, where you don't want the eye to be directed. I mean, I've done productions where we've deliberately made things sort of just off the edge of screen, very bright, because the whole point is those actors, the cast, were in the dark and enlightenment was just beyond them. But most of the time it's about faces. Almost every scene, actors are going to be talking and you want to see them. And rather than have to do lots of work vignetting or sorting things out later, you want as good, if you like, a negative to begin with. You almost want it to feel like those beautiful days when they only ever could go to the lab with their print. So they were given pre-light days, which I don't think even exist anymore, because they had to get it right. Those cinematographers just had to nail it. Now we've got more tools to help. I think they've almost been given less time to do that, because producers and other people and cinematographers themselves know they can solve those problems later, flag off a wall, brighten an eye, whatever it might be. But it's really to try and direct them through this path of choices to make sure that they've got everything they need, including making LUTs, which we might get onto. And that's another thing with LUTs is the show might want a golden look, and you might make them a golden LUT, or they might do it in, hopefully in lighting, but you don't want anything to be hidden. You don't want to create any look that's so powerful during the process that it's going to hide problems. And if you change your mind later on, reveal things that were hidden during that process.
I'm going to come back at that a second, because I remember thinking about gold. Immediately springs to mind your work with Rob Hardy on Devs, and and Rob. One of my favorite quotes from Rob is, you find your film in the prep room. To what extent is the color balance that you're finding in the prep room, the LUTs and the LMTs you're creating in the prep room, to what extent are you finding, are they getting closer and closer to what you're delivering at the back end now? Is there or are they a LUT that's just there as a shooting guide, as a shooting principle?
Oh, it really varies. It really does. I'm sort of, with some productions, steering away from a LUT with a certain look so that the cinematographer is confident that they're seeing what they're capturing. Other times they will want a very bold look on something because that's what they really have decided they want, and they don't want execs or anyone to be shocked by that later on. So, they want everyone on board, which is always good to do. You don't want battles later. You want some options possibly. But it is great when you strike upon that combination of the way it's being lit and graded and, visual effects and everything, and everyone's in that thing, and it carries that through all the way. That's like being able to pre-light something and get it right in the camera to begin with. And you'll probably never get it looking better than that. It's better to be able to enhance and play with things and be able to take it in different directions rather than have to salvage anything or fix anything. That's why I remember years ago a DP saying he didn't like the term color correction because it inferred that there was something wrong to begin with. They liked color enhancement, which is what we hope we're doing rather than correcting anything.
Tom, I'm going to turn over to you, Tom, because I think it's kind of a natural thing. And this isn't an ACES session, but
yeah,
Tom,
I'll have a break.
We have other films we can direct you to for ACES. This isn't an ACES session. Tom, tell me about, you're a big advocate of ACES, though, and this kind of ties into our theme today. Why are you such a big advocate of ACES?
I mean, as a company or internally, we sort of talk about ACES by default unless told otherwise. So, we've done some shows recently with ACER, and we've had that opportunity to have that dialogue. But so often, we were actually having this conversation before the stream, we don't have that dialogue. So it's important to set some sort of standard. ACES is a well-known standard that virtually every post-production company knows. Now, you can make up any what's called color-managed workflow, but you need a color-managed workflow of some form in order to deal with the fact that you've got multiple inputs and multiple different deliverables. So you've got to have some sort of intermediary space and for something to go into that and to go out of it. ACES is already built. It's designed for the job. It does have, obviously nuances which are still being worked on. There's going to be like ACES 2.0, and it's been iterated on. But everybody or the vast majority of the industry are all inputting on that. So it is a good starting point, even though you might have to, for certain scenarios, fudge the edges where it doesn't work. But at least it's a standard everyone knows. Otherwise, if you go and pick one that's designed by a specific post company, then there's a huge amount of work educating all the different stakeholders on that way of working. So for us, if we haven't got the post company and the other stakeholders involved, when we get involved, then we just set up an ACES pipeline by default unless otherwise told. Yeah.
And okay, so I'm thinking about this. There was a time, and this is one thing I would want to comment on ACES, and it's a brief comment. There was a time when ACES was believed to be quite prescriptive, and was quite prescriptive. And I did a session recently on his plant materials with which mission we're involved with, which was Sam Chinworth over at Technicolor, and who'd done Lego, all of the Lego franchise. He was one of the first people to adopt and work with ACES, and he was saying that the change in version 2 is just phenomenal, and what he was able to do, and how he was able to take Jean-Clément Sauré's curves from season 1 and apply them within an ACES pipeline in season 2. Season 1 wasn't. And actually have the malleability in the grade to still work with it. And I think there's a slight misconception about ACES, that it is entirely prescriptive and takes you down one channel from which you can't escape. And ACES with that, and we were talking about ACES earlier and some of the shortfalls there, but isn't that the case? And also, if I can, Asa, to prompt you on ARI, which we were talking about earlier.
Yes, no, just to echo really what Tom was saying with ACES, it's pretty much the first thing we write down, even though there are other workflows or DRTs you might use where you prefer different response to the shadows, etc. Trying to remember the question. Sorry.
Well, no, it's about why ACES. Why is ACES, thinking about this managed color pipeline? Why is ACES desirable? Well,
when we've gone other routes which have been worked for most people, you often get a VFX house popping up and saying, no, we want to go ACES. We don't want to go ARRI linear with things or whatever. Or if you're doing, I don't know, Red IPP2 as a DRT or some other route, or you've just created your own one, then you have to create IDTs and ODTs for everyone, and they better work, because if they don't, you're the company that's sort of demanded or that you've worked a certain way. It's recognized by all the streaming services, everyone you're going to deliver to. So it's really the easiest way, as Tom says, to make sure there's not going to be any surprises, and anyone joining the party late, because that happens, isn't going to have a problem with it. With ARRI, the only thing with ARRI and ACES is the primaries and the blues are outside that. So with blue neon signs or blue flares, they will break up. Now there's an LMT that you can just add to the processing dailies and in the grade that's even on the ACES website. We've got our own, but they've got one that you can use that completely sorts that problem out. But it's the odd thing like that has come up for a DP a couple of years ago, or an effects house or whoever it may be with it, and then they say, oh, ACES, you can't use ACES with ARRIs or something, and it's nonsense.
Yeah. I think what's quite good about ACES is that it's an iterated format. It's basically improved on, and that multiple people are working on it. So there's absolutely, obviously, known issues with it. With the saturation issues, it's already something that's been highlighted to fix in 2.0, and there's some really interesting discussions. If you go on the ACES website, you can kind of follow that with some really interesting solutions on how they're solving those outer gamut issues, as well as also there's been a lot of talk about the RRT. That's basically the thing that kind of gives you the default 709 look or whatever. It's obviously very aggressive, and I think they're going to tackle that, because they just basically want to make sure they put back that creative freedom. But it comes down to the thing is it's a working standard of which that if you choose it, you're not going to have any major problems down the line. As if you kind of make something up, then you are responsible for making sure that every single stakeholder gets it right, and very often they don't first time.
I'm going to hand over here to Paco as well. Paco, you've been very quiet here, I think.
Yeah.
What's the colour supervisor and the daily's perspective on setting up on the show LUTs and the LMTs?
So normally what I would do, or what we would do at Mission, is if ASA, for example, has set a look for a particular show and we are going to do all the dailies processing and we're going to have our DITs on set working with production. The first thing that we do is obviously take care that that LMT is applied correctly across to any device or any camera that we might be working with. Sometimes production starts with a single, very well-defined camera source that they're going to work, but later on during production, they might add a secondary camera, a B camera, a C camera, or even they would add GoPros or some other cameras to actually get a particular shot depending on the story they want to tell. So what we do is we take care that all those cameras tie into the workflow properly and correctly. And if there's any LUT boxes that the production might want to use or the DOPs want to use, obviously we create the LUTs for those LUT boxes so they work properly. And also in the end, what we try to do is make the DOP comfortable during production so they can actually see what they intended from the very beginning, from prep, and they can focus on the creative decisions. So we are there to kind of be the technological partner of the DOP and kind of help them with all the technical hassle and sort it out for them. So that's mostly, try to kind of brief explain it. That would be it. Obviously, we would always, as Asa Schultz said at the beginning, be very wary of what the deliverables are at the end. So and speaking of resolution before, the reason maybe we would go for ASIS is because it's the largest container there as well. It's a non-destructive framework that actually would give us the flexibility to change if we have to in the future. So that is mostly it. So what we would try to work from our color supervision role.
And would you be going backwards and forwards with the post house at this point? And to what extent are they? What's that line of communication like?
What we would try to have one very thorough and deep conversation where we obviously highlight how the workflow is going to be, what decisions are taken. Sometimes might happen that the director might, the DOP might want several LMTs or several looks, so we have to adjust that. And obviously that is an exponential, for us, it will have an exponential impact, because if there are 3 cameras or 2 cameras, if there is a new LMT or a secondary LMT, we have to do twice as many LUTs for all the devices involved. We also try to have conversations with post to kind of have very clear any instructions that they might have on how they want to treat dailies. For example, sometimes they might say, we really want to treat the dailies here with 1/3 of a stop in the CDLs. So we will instruct the DITs and the lab operators to follow that decision during the dailies rendering and production. So that would be it.
And again, and at that point, you're working with both monitors and scopes on set, and scoping very, very common on set.
Yeah.
And we've got a short film that you kindly shot for us yesterday, I think. And I think it's let's see a bit of technology here, and let's see what Paco's talking about. And we're going to hear Paco's voice, but this time recorded, although you might be hearing it recorded. Tom.
Okay, over to VT.
HDR production is consolidating, and we know this because we see more and more DOPs and DITs that are shooting their first HDR shows. HDR monitoring on set would be ideal. Something like the Sony BVM-171 would be very well suited for on-set operation. Something like the Sony HX310 that I have right behind me is more suited for a grading suite. We can also add the analysis capabilities of leader scopes. With leader scopes, what we could do is activate an HDR mode that would help DOPs and DITs take informed decisions while they're crafting their images. For example, here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to activate the HDR mode we're going to turn it on and choose, firstly, the standard that I'm going to work on. In this case, if I'm going to deliver a Dolby Vision master, I would choose PQ. Then what I could do is set the upper limit of my readings of the scopes. I could go up to 10,000 nits, which is how the PQ curve was designed, or 4,000 nits, which is actually the Dolby Vision mastering format. But the display that I have in front of me, the Sony HX310, goes up to 1000 nits, and that's actually the level that I really want to analyze. So I activate it, and then in reference levels I have the option of going to 51% or 58%. The reason this happens is because 51% was how initially the PQ signal was designed, to set diffuse white on 100 nits. When we set it at 58%, we follow the latest recommendation to go up to 203 nits of diffuse white. Once I complete this, I could see that my lidoscope starts to show the different nit levels to the right of the scope. And one mode that I'm going to enable right now is the Cinezone mode. What I'm going to do here is actually turn on false color mode, where we're going to see displayed a color pattern where everything that goes from black to white is what is going to be considered within the SDR levels. This is from 0 to 203 nits, and anything that starts from the blue color, where we have the 203 nits of diffuse white defined, anything that goes beyond that will have a color pattern. For example, in this shot we could see that almost everything is within the SDR limits, but we could see that the headlights especially are starting to peak around 600 and almost 700 nits. This could really help DOPs and DITs to actually define how they would work with the exposure while they're on set. If we go to a night shot over here, we could see how in this particular shot the torch of our character is the only element that is going beyond the SDR threshold. So actually we could start to design creatively the storytelling with how we set our images over diffuse white. I do recommend that you start to develop an eye for HDR imagery, to analyze the pictures that you've shot with your colorist, to go into the grading suite and see how the waveform is displayed and how the signal is represented in HDR. That would really help you to develop an eye for HDR and start to defining in the future different levels of diffuse white or a different threshold for peak brightness depending on the story that you want to tell. Is HDR monitoring mandatory? Well, I definitely think that HDR monitoring is really helpful to judge our HDR images. I do think that we can't always control the viewing environments on set, and they definitely never going to meet the standards of HDR grading suites as they're built. So I do think that having the possibility of adding a lidoscope into our production would really help us to objectively judge the images and help us make better creative decisions for our HDR productions.
Well, we're back in the rooms. Thank you, Paco, and welcome back, Paco.
Thank you.
So, fun enough, we're going to turn to you first here. We're going to look at why is HDR monitoring important across the chain, and where is it? Where should it be most applied? Paco, starting with you. You know, where should it be applied?
Well, definitely, I do think, as I said in the video, that it is going to be really beneficial to have it on set. Having those instances where you're really not sure where your exposure is, and kind of double checking that what you're seeing in HDR is actually the best result you could get. And obviously that is going to translate properly in SDR later down the chain is actually really key. One thing that I didn't mention in the video, for example, is obviously you have to have your color pipeline spot on here. Something that might happen is that you would still have some SDR monitoring on set, obviously, but you would have to prepare an HDR output for these monitors. So actually, we need to be also very sure, and that would be the job of the color supervisor, that in that pipeline we set the correct output transform to the monitor, so we are actually sure that what we're viewing is what we're going to get later in post. So and I think that is the key of this, is that you really want to prevent, well, not prevent, but you really want to highlight things that might pop up during the shoot that later on could be inherited by the VFX team, or later on maybe the colorist might have to take care of. And obviously you would want to do that in HDR. If you do that in SDR, you wouldn't know what's going on, and no one would flag it until maybe someone like Asa Scholl starts working on the grade and suddenly realizes that something was wrong.
So Asa, from your perspective, it's a given, right? You're working in HDR.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting what Becca was saying, because I looked at some rushes the other day in HDR for a project we're working on, and it was an airport, and there appeared to be, firstly in SDR, beautiful sun coming through, backlit. And then I noticed in HDR that those were big 20K lights on cherry pickers, because you'll see all of that. You can't be hidden. And then I actually was just flagged that to editorial, that they needed to probably flag that to VFX, that they're going to have to remove them, which you want to know ahead of time, possibly on set would be great. Otherwise, maybe the DP goes, I know that's the way I'm going to light it, so I'll talk to my visual effects supervisor, because you don't want that to crop up with 3 days of the grade left and no time to kind of fix it. That becomes very messy or expensive.
Which kind of links into this idea of HDR in the edit, and that the editor is editing, looking at an HDR image, so that they're making a judgment call on that use of image, which again feeds into this idea of where you want to be in the chain. When it arrives in the grade, you want it to be a fairly complete, conformed, final story tell. And if there
are situations where you'll get things that when they're cut together because of changing weather and light become very, very apparent in HDR. And of course we want editors really to go on performance, but if there are a couple of options of when they cut something, if clouds are coming in and out or lighting changes on a train or wherever it might be, it'd be great if they can do that. And those that I've worked with that have had HDR monitoring, have spotted those things, but it's still pretty rare, in my experience, that editorial are having HDR dailies. I don't know if you guys have seen that, or if it's increasing.
Paco, do you think there's more HDR dailies coming through now?
Well, there's definitely starting to be a demand of doing dailies in HDR and using platforms that actually can deliver some of those files. Certainly from missions perspective, we always want to be ahead of the curve and actually start to offer that to kind of, well, tie into the demands of the platforms. Still, the majority is still being Rec 709. We can't really deny that, but the HDR dailies is really going to start to pick up from now on, I think.
And coming back, if I can, to you, Asa. I'm thinking about deliverables again. you know, and we were talking about this earlier on, and it depends on what grading system you're operating on. But if your deliverable is, if you're working on a NAM, GAM, it's a NAM and VDM, no longer the GAM, so the non-graded archival master, the graded archival master, and the video decision master. If the change now is that Netflix want to take out the graded archival master, from where you are, we were talking about this earlier, and you can output that non-graded archival master from the base.
Yeah, the Baselight is the tool we use to grade on, and it's our final device, as it were, where everything is before rendering out from there, so that it will have all the fixes in. QC reports will come back to us and things will be despotted, or they may go back off to VFX or to online to paint things out or do things, or we do titles, but they'll come back into the Baselight. So that NAM, the non-graded master, which used to just be the conform or submaster and out onto HDCAM SR, comes from the Baselight. So you're basically turning off various grades and things, but leaving the fixes in. Other grading systems, it's not made from there. They go back to the Flame or wherever it was conformed on, which is slightly trickier because you have to make sure that both your timeline perhaps and that are identical at all times. And then it's output from the Flame instead. But yeah, no, on the Baselight, that's our platform. We view HDR and SDR at the same time. Almost always the HDR grade first, and then for most projects, the Dolby analysis and trim, which we're moving on to version 4 rather than 2.9, but that's a whole other sort of conversation probably. And sometimes even if you're not delivering a Dolby SDR derived, you might just use that process to take you on the first step. During lockdown, when people couldn't come in and they could only view SDR on a Clearview link we were using through iPad Pros, I'd have to do the HDR first, which is great, and then analyze it and trim in Dolby for them then to start the grade, as it were, in SDR, even though I've got HDR and SDR happening at the same time, which is just another thing to sort of put through. But
going back and thinking that you are delivering both for HDR and for SDR, but with HDR increasingly the primary deliverable. Thinking about that and thinking about if you're on set and your primary monitoring is HDR, should you have confidence in that for the SDR deliverable as well?
Yes. I mean, yeah, if it's going to work in HDR, I can't see a situation it's not going to work in SDR, or you'd miss some. I'm trying to think what you would miss or get wrong. I can't think of. Can you guys? I mean, really, that's why I prefer to grade that way first. And even if I was I'd love to grade that way first if I was even doing a theatrical with the P3 sort of being the primary thing, because you will get a better balance throughout. Your highlights will be the same color. You'll notice if skies are different colors and brightnesses, and you'll be getting those much closer. So anything after that is only going to be more accurate. The other way around, I think it would be a lot more work.
Yeah, I mean, grading is a reductive process. So it's always better to go from your original clay down to a sort of a model, and then you find out the details. You don't want to be putting lumps of clay back on. You end up with something that looks like a Frankenstein. That's probably a sort of a loose analogy. But also going back to editorial as well, if you're cutting stuff and you're just looking at it at 709, you might cut things differently. If you know that you're going from a bright outside scene to a dark scene back to a bright scene, you might reduce those cuts, or you might deliberately increase them if that's the story. You're using these tools to tell the story, and you don't know that they're there, or you don't know the impact it might have in HDR. Then you're going to see it in the grade and go, oh my gosh, this doesn't work. And then you're going back again and recutting it. And then you're then having to regrade it. That costs money as well. But also, you're sitting maybe in the edit, it could be for a month or it could be for 9 months. And all of a sudden you get into the grade and you've got some massive surprises. And there's, you can go at sort of at the low end, you can get a decent sort of 55-inch consumer TV. So it doesn't have to cost the earth. And in a sense, they're almost cheaper than some of the grade 1 monitors. But if you can step up and get a reasonably decent grade 1 monitor. There's obviously the PVMX 2400, or there's the E171 if you don't mind a bit of a smaller monitor. So they're really sort of great choices. And we really should be doing at least HDR at a minimum. and if we can, dual HDR, SDR monitoring right from all the way down the pipe. And I know it's something that, in conversations I've had privately with some of the streaming companies, they're wanting, and really it's sort of they're just waiting for all the stakeholders to kind of come on board. As a company, a little bit of tooting our own horn on a project I can't say it. I've got unapologetic. That's what I was trying to say. We demoed the last BSU show when we were allowed to have one. That whole pipeline, so that on set we showed HDR in editorial that it was possible and it worked, and also HDR in the daily, so you can now with the iPad Pro and the new iPhone, as long as the cloud platform supports it, you can do it. So the technology's there. There's nothing stopping us from doing it other than the will to say yes, really, at that, and as the stakeholders need to understand the value of wanting to go and make this step forward. And I think, it's all this kind of like seeing is believing. People talk about, look at, I take the analogy of VR. When you're watching someone else put on a VR headset on and you're watching it on 2D, you don't understand why everybody's going wow and stuff like that until you stick the VR headset on yourself, and then you go, oh my goodness, I'm actually in this world. And HDR is kind of the same. Until you start seeing it and actually start working with it, you don't get it. So it's this transition that we're struggling with at the moment, where we haven't got this sort of tipping point with certainly productions in the shooting stage, where all of a sudden once you've had it, you then can't live without it. So I do think we're on that cusp. I think in the next 12 to 18 months we'll see this transition happen quite rapidly.
And again, is it important? And again, I'm going to ask Asa really, as the grading artist, is it important that the color acuity, the color sense, the color is continuous, and the color representation on that monitoring is continuous? Because when you get into your pretty much every post house in the country, you're going to find a Sony BVM X300 or HX310 in the vast majority, anyway, certainly. So the idea that you've got the same picture and the same colors carrying through.
Yeah, I mean, you do. It's become so much better in the last few years that everyone's got pretty much the same kit viewing experience. Everything is calibrated constantly. The studios pretty much dictate X300s or X310s. They want to know what your calibration. They say, these are the numbers we want you to hit. Can you confirm that? Judd offset or not Judd, going through. And it's great because there's no more of it going somewhere else and looking different. That awful thing probably 10 years ago where every monitor was a bit different and people got really worried about things. They're not, the consistency's brilliant. That's what we need to get from set, really, that there's no shock anymore. I mean, we have dailies on various platforms that are using obviously H.264s and things that are really compressed. There's always a little bit of fear at certain stages in dark scenes because things just turn to mush, which is then again why if they were viewing it on set more, they would, they'd worry less going through.
And again, if I can, and the importance of test and measurement, in prep, on set, and in the grade. Let's if I can, let's start with you, Paco, again. Why is test and measurement so important?
Well, it is important because we're talking that, our eyes at some point trick us. You get used to pictures or to the environment, the light environment so much that we obviously don't see colors the same all the time. We're really dependent on how the lighting environment is. And having something that actually helps us to kind of really precisely know where our images sit is invaluable because, as I said, sometimes the eyes trick you. You might think that you have diffuse white set on a very specific part of the image for the whole show, and suddenly you look at your leaderscope and suddenly realize, oh, in this shot I just went 50 nits higher, and I didn't realize it when I hit play, even though I've gone through it like many times. I've checked it so many times. You sometimes really need the help of a scope to kind of don't let your eyes trick you.
Absolutely, and from that perspective, you've been using the leader scope recently. I think has that made a difference to the way that you'll be looking at pictures in the future?
Yeah, well, I really love the false color, and I actually once I got it, the first thing I did was check a HDR show I did last year, and actually what I realized was that we had the instruction of the DOP that never go beyond 500 nits, except a few key moments, obviously where we want to kind of make the story. Well, to fit it into the story. And I was checking it and suddenly realizing that a shot that previously was at 500 nits, and 3 shots later, it was like 550. And I was like, that might be a bit embarrassing, but I didn't realize the moment I did it that I actually went 50 nits higher. Yeah.
Did you see it visually once you knew?
Yeah, yeah, once you see it, you go and, oh yeah, now I do see it. But in the flow, when you play it for the first time, it is tricky, especially when we're talking about highlight levels and these thresholds that now we're talking with HDR monitors.
Tom, scoping. Why is scoping important to you, Tom?
Well, I mean, it's the point of absolute truth. I mean, kind of reiterating kind of some of the things we said before. You walk outside and you're filming on the street, and you're using, that sort of vapor lighting, and then you come into a room. You've adjusted your white point to that new orange, and everything's going to look, sort of a greeny blue, and you then sit there going, right, well, everything's looking too greeny blue. Let's warm it up a bit. And if you looked at the scopes immediately, you would start to see this sort of like, 3 peaks mounting, and you would kind of be going, well, this is, there's a difference between here, what's actually happening and what my eyes are seeing. It's just that point of truth where it's telling you absolute values, and your eye is it's subjective to the environment you're in, how much luminance is in the room, how much background lighting there is, even how old or how young you are as well. So these are all factors. So I always, in a sense, the scopes for me is always my primary reference, and then you just want to see how it looks and how it feels on the screen, because you're so easy. I mean, Asa does this every day, day in and out. So, but I'm sure he's probably switching through stuff and then looks at something else to refresh his eyes every now and then, because you get used to it, and you can end up getting a stronger and stronger and stronger grade if you don't. I mean, maybe you can elaborate a bit more.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's a classic thing. You're doing night, which you might want very blue. Some do, some don't, or an underwater sequence or whatever it might be. And if you grade shot to shot to shot and keep going, as you get used to it, you're going to push more and more and more blue into it. It's just natural. So our environment is a very standard grey, lit with certain nit value. But to combat that, usually just once I've got that scene, I refer back to one master shot so that I can see that. But I'll also be doing that on scopes, check that saturation level and that floor level of black. Because the classic thing, highlights and lowlights, but with black is often when you do P3 first, you're doing projected, because it's a lower contrast image, 1500 to 1. You won't really realize the difference in your black levels very much, because you don't really notice those below 60, 70 code value. You'll see that on a monitor, on a scope rather, and you'll see it later on a monitor. But those are the things that often get picked up in QC, lit raised blacks, crushed blacks, comparing things, because they will QC it through a monitor. Our QC department uses the leader scope as well, but also they're probably lifting blacks on the monitor, when then it's easier to see those differences in the more noise levels change or colors change. So yeah, monitoring is very, very important with scopes at a certain stage. Certainly with nit values, things that you can get very used to bright things and suddenly look over and go, I'm really about 500 nits on this. And you go, yeah, actually that is really bright. Compare it to the SDR. Oh no, really, now I'm just enjoying the depth of it, the brightness, but that's taking me away from what the scene's all about. So yeah, that's why you have to go back and forth, insist on more time to be able to grade things and then check them technically. And that route goes from the grade. Everyone may have signed it off, but then there's that technical process through QC, our own internal QC, then to the streaming service, and then back. And then usually with the collaboration of various people within the team, we'll go through, because we'll be given FYIs, and we might want to fix those or not. And then sort of level 1, 2, and 3 on things that may need fixing, or can you, or, you know, they'll see a camera reflection in a mirror, and you really want to fix those. But it's not finished, and well, it's not finished till it's delivered, and then it's still not finished, because you can remaster things like we did with the Crown forevermore. I told some clients that recently, and they got really depressed because they thought they'd actually delivered their. It was a great show, but it was this thought that someone in a year might come back and go, "Oh, we've noticed," and then they'd have to fix things after that.
And finally, I'm going to wrap this. We're at the hour, so I am going to wrap it on the hour. We almost made it. We almost did it. Last words, Tom. Last words. The importance of a managed color HDR color pipeline. Why is it so important? You got 2 sentences.
You know, you don't manage it, it's going to be chaos. It costs money, and it probably you probably get an undesired result at the end of it. And so, yeah, fix it in pre is the slogan.
I like that.
Paco.
Well, if I have to say something, just test it. Just like I said in the video, speak to your colorist, speak to anyone that will follow after the work you do. Try to develop an eye for HDR. You actually need to get used to how pictures are seen in an HDR monitor. Try to develop that eye. There are things that you are used to in SDR that opens a window of possibilities later on. So develop the understanding and develop the critical eye that you already have for SDR, develop it for HDR.
And Asa, you always seem to get the last word in my opinion. Asa.
Yeah, it's twofold really. I mean, one is just getting the best possible result at the end. The more you can see early on, you'll achieve that easier and faster, and it'll be more beautiful. And also kind of just those hidden things. VFX are a classic one. And hopefully they'll be viewing more and more in HDR, but it'd be brilliant from the set forward. If everyone is, it's just more easy collaborative process, less worries, and you'll just get a better result faster.
If I can, I'm going to wrap it by saying, you know, we started on this idea of a managed HDR color pipeline, and it's about breaking down the barriers in my world view here. It's breaking down the barriers between prep as production as a siloed function and post as something that happens afterwards. The word doesn't happen, post. It doesn't help, rather, the word post. It should be one joined up continuous process in which the collaborators are all working together with the director's artistic intent in mind. And that creative intent is at the heart of what everyone here is looking to achieve and to fulfill. Thank you to my panelists, to Tom Mitchell, Paco Ramos, and to Asa Scholl. Always a pleasure to see you all. And if I can add and say, if you've enjoyed this, tell everyone else. It's going to be recorded and played out. We'll send out a link shortly. Thank you to our sponsors, Sony and Leader, and thank you to Big Pic Media and to Band Pro for supporting this endeavor. We want as many people as possible to watch this. We want people to pick up on the touch points. The touch points are about how technology can support the creative endeavor and how working together across the pipeline is absolutely essential. The point again is not to save money, it is to spend it wisely for the best possible creative outcome. Thank you for watching. Take care, stay safe. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.